Vernessa,
Shawn.
I'm glad we got to sit down here and get to talk with you and, get to know you a little bit better and see uh, who Vernessa Pollard is.
I'm still, figuring that out. Every day is a new day, but I'm really excited for this opportunity to chat with you and really honored to have the opportunity to sit down and exchange
Mm.
insights in this way.
Awesome, awesome. So, where did you go to college? Where did you go to law school? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I am a Bison, a proud graduate of Howard University here in Washington, D.C. I went to Howard as a communications major.
Okay.
In 1992. So, very different beginnings in terms of where I saw myself. I thought that I was going to go into radio or film production. And I started out as a general communications major. First semester, one of my professors at Howard said, at the time, the career path in this industry is, upon graduation, you'll probably, get a job maybe as a production assistant that's unpaid. And so I thought that might not work so well for me. And I wanted a career path that was a little more certain in terms of the steps. I'm sort of a planner by nature. And Howard had this very unique major that combined communications and law. So I actually got my BA in communications, but the subspecialty was legal communication.
Okay.
And the class was taught by an adjunct professor, a lawyer named Sherry Blood, who at the time was the deputy general counsel for PBS. And she was my first introduction into what lawyers are. And she was extraordinary. She was poised. She was beautiful. She was demanding, but she also, for the first time, introduced the concept that there was a legal path that wasn't litigation, because that at that time, that was my exposure, right? You see the courtroom dramas on TV, you think you're exactly. And so my concept of what a lawyer was a courtroom lawyer or a litigator. And she was a regulatory lawyer. So she was a communications and IP lawyer. And she taught this course on the law of communications and introduced me and the other students to the concept that there was something between corporate law and litigation, which was being a regulatory lawyer. So that was the first seed for me. And she was just what I call, and a concept that one of my mentors talks about is a sightline. She was my first professional sightline, and the sightline in sort of professional development terms is somebody that you can see on the horizon. It's a vantage point that gives you some perspective and allows you to visualize what's possible from where you are. And so she was that for me. And beyond teaching the substance of regulatory law and the framework for the APA at that very nascent stage in my kind of career, she, like a lot of the professors at Howard, was psychologically and personally invested in the success, growth, and well-being of her students. And that was also impactful for me.
Okay. Awesome. Awesome.
So that's where I started at Howard. And then from there, I went to Temple Law School in Philadelphia. And Temple at the time was known, and still is, for churning out very high quality, well-trained litigators.
Okay.
They had a trial advocacy program that was nationally recognized. They were known for, churning out people who were ready upon graduation to stand up in court, U.S. attorneys, DAs, trial lawyers. And so even though I had that inkling that there was this thing of regulatory law, I definitely moved in the direction of litigation because Temple's trial ad program was nationally recognized, and it just seemed like a natural step for me, and a way to leverage my communications degree.
Okay. Did you feel a little scared, but then we're like, I want to challenge myself in this area since before all you knew was the litigation side?
For sure. Being a litigator and leveraging my communications background and that degree because it was at Howard, it was communications theory. It was delving into the science of communications and all those things. So I felt like going the litigation route was definitely a way to play off my undergraduate degree, to play off of my strengths, and to leverage what Temple Law School was known for, which was litigation. So I kind of forgot about the regulatory piece, but things come around.
So how did you then pivot into this regulatory path at that point?
So I graduated from Temple Law. I took a very traditional path in law in that I went through the on-campus recruiting process as a second year. I had lots of offers from some of the big Philadelphia law firms. I chose to go to, I think at that time it was the third largest law firm in Philadelphia that also was known for its litigation practice. And I got an offer my second year as a summer associate. So upon graduation, I started as a junior lawyer at this Philadelphia law firm. And as a junior litigation associate at that time, we weren't expected to specialize. So you kind of did everything. You're doing employment law one week, a banking litigation case the next week. The week after that, it might be a railroad, injury, personal injury claim. So I really got the breadth of litigation, but being a junior lawyer, you're not in court, obviously, because you're representing huge corporations and they want very experienced lawyers.
Correct.
So it was a lot of research. It was a lot of writing. I really appreciated, honing those analytical skills. And it was tremendous training. What I found difficult about being a junior litigation associate in a big law firm is that often I was 10, 20, 30 people away from maybe the senior partner or the client. So you spent a lot of time researching issues, but often it was hard to connect how the issues you were researching actually fed into the strategy. And so I recall, early on spending maybe 2 weeks researching this concept of the self-critical analysis privilege. And it was the idea that companies have a right to investigate themselves, analyze, their operations, and for those operations and analyses to be protected, right, from public consumption. And I was digging into this theory and this law for weeks and weeks. And then when I saw the final brief in the case, it was like a footnote. All right. So that was perspective. That was healthy perspective. And I think what I started to discover as a junior litigator, despite the fact that I had great training, really learned the importance of writing and research. I had tremendous mentors. Early on, people who were honest and gave, critical, sometimes harsh feedback. But again, through line in my career is that I was lucky and I think blessed to find people who were personally and psychologically invested in my success. And what that looked like was honesty, accountability, real feedback, but all in the vein of making me the best that I could be. But what I realized is that I really wanted to know something, like a subject area really well. I didn't want to be a generalist who was kind of pivoting between all these things. And I stumbled upon a group of lawyers at my first law firm job who were former U.S. attorneys. So they were building a criminal defense practice. And the first case that I was asked to help with that group involved an FDA regulated product. It was a medical device case. It was a situation where an individual and company were making and marketing an FDA regulated product. FDA had some questions about the legal status of that product. So there are a ton of issues. And as the junior lawyer on the team, often you're engaged in the fact that you're researching law, but you're also getting the story together. You're figuring out the facts. And so as a part of that, I was asked to subpoena records and documents from FDA.
Okay.
So as a third year lawyer, that was my first introduction to the FDA as an agency. And I had to go to the FDA's website and figure out, well, if you want to get records from FDA, how do you do that? But as I was looking at the website, I became fascinated by the scope and breadth of what FDA does. Unlike some of the other cases that I've worked on, the agency's mission really connected for me because it's things that we eat and the things that we use to treat disease. And the scope of what they did, I found fascinating. And so I did indeed figure out how to subpoena records from the FDA, which I did. And as a part of that process, I had to call and coordinate with an FDA lawyer. And so that was my first, there are lawyers who work at FDA who are practicing regulatory law. So that was the connection point. And I worked on that case. And then my husband, who was an active duty Air Force judge advocate general at the time, got transferred. And so we had to move to DC. And that was the opportunity for me to figure out, do I want to continue to be a litigation associate in big law, or is this an opportunity for me to pivot and maybe work in government or, have a different skill set? Because at the time, my first law firm didn't have a DC office.
Okay.
So I was kind of figuring out, is this my opportunity to pivot and really learn something and learn an area as opposed to being more of a generalist?
Okay.
And the long story short is I got hired at FDA in the Office of Chief Counsel, and so began.
And how long were you there?
I was at FDA for 6 years.
6 years. Okay.
I still consider it, no knock on DLA or any other job that I've had, the best professional experience, the best training ground. I had both of my children while I was at the agency, my two youngest children, and the folks there sort of formed another through line in my life, because a lot of us, had our kids there. So it really became a family and just a really great learning experience for me that I think catapulted, if that's a word I can use, my professional development.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Some things and maybe some perspectives that we have sometime in industry is that, no, FDA is coming in, get everything together up, and I know that there's other parts behind the scenes where a lot of the paperwork is getting written and different things like that.
Mhm.
What's the mindset from the time that you were at the FDA? Is it, hey, let's go hunt and get these perpetrators, or is it, hey, look, let's protect, the patients and the end users and figure out how we can accomplish this through what we're doing?
I think it was a little bit of both.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I had the pleasure of being trained by Eric Blumberg. And Eric Blumberg, we call him Rick, was the Deputy General Counsel for litigation at the time. And he is he is a legend in the food and drug bar. He was instrumental in establishing and litigating the Park case, which created the Park Doctrine, which is essentially the notion that individual corporate officers can be held vicariously liable or responsible for the misconduct, the violations of the company. So he was involved in sort of creating the legal and enforcement framework in which FDA operates. He was very special to me. And he was a character, but also a brilliant lawyer. And his baseline, because there were many instances where he would be pushing for us to take an enforcement action or bring an enforcement action. And sometimes, I would say, is this what we should be doing? Is this really worth the resources? And his response invariably would be, to me and others, if this action that we don't take were to result in somebody that you love or care about being harmed, would your feelings on whether we pursue the action be different? And so his baseline and the agency's baseline was always rooted in that public health mission, both as a consumer protection agency and a scientific agency. And so that was always the thread. What is the right thing to do for the consumer? But there were some cases where there were companies that, for whatever reason, and sometimes we didn't even know what the reason was, that had developed a rather negative reputation within chief counsel's office or within compliance circles at the agency. And often it could have been some misconduct or interaction from decades past. But as new enforcement and compliance professionals come in, new lawyers, you're trained by people who have all of this history, right, and this context. And so to a certain extent, and this was not always great, your perception of a particular company or the way that you might review and look at the information they're giving to you is framed through the lens of history, of prior conduct, of the way they show up. So I definitely think everything was rooted in the public health, but there were some instances where some companies, for good or bad, had developed reputations as being not the best actors or not having a culture of compliance. And so, that would certainly inform the positions that the agency took, especially from an enforcement and compliance standpoint.
Well, that's very interesting. You like to think that each one is taken individually, but I have found myself, even through doing different audits, we do it all the time on our side as well, from auditing suppliers. There's some suppliers, and I've consulted at different companies. Sometimes the site can be great, but in general, you just approach it with a little bit more of like, I'm going to look a little extra closely. This part here, I don't think they're going to be able to take care of it and fix it. I need to come back in and I need to check in over and over again.
Of course.
That's interesting that that's also happening with the FDA. I mean, that makes complete sense.
Sure. I believe that FDA, for the most part, is a neutral, scientific, mission-driven public health agency. But like any other organization, it's made up of individuals, right? And we are all susceptible to our subjective judgments about people, about companies, about situations. And so when I'm, talking with clients, as I'm sure is the case for you, about strategy or how to engage or how to approach, when to push, when to concede a point, it's always through the lens of we're dealing with individuals, right, who are working within a legal and regulatory framework, but they're individuals, goals, metrics, pressures, considerations that are obviously going to inform how they view a situation or the options that they take. And so when you're developing a strategy, when you're responding to a 483, you would be doing a disservice to the company and your clients if you're not taking into consideration the individual perspectives and who these people are and how their experiences of the company might inform, how they look at the information you're presenting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I can imagine your experience, your background with the FDA, how many years you've been in practice. You can't look at the standards, and I imagine you can't look at the law itself and then be able, just off of the text alone, tell this is too far. We need to do more here. All of those different sort of nuanced things that might save the company a lot of work. Is that something you've found to be extremely helpful in your legal practice?
Certainly. I think having the perspective of having been the regulator, and one of the things that was great about FDA is the room to struggle over the regulations, right? To read the preamble or read this regulation that was written in 1980, right? When some of the technological advancements and things that this regulation is meant to apply to weren't even envisioned at that time, right? And so what was fascinating and challenging about being a lawyer in the agency is how to interpret the words on the page to achieve the goals of the agency. So there was a lot of creativity in that. There was a lot of intense historical research and looking at precedents and really thinking about what are the ways that the agency can legally stretch the bounds of this interpretation to achieve the goal, and when might the agency stretch the bounds of interpretation too far such that they're subject to challenge. And I found that to be a fascinating part of the work. But also enlightening because FDA also got sued a lot when I was in chief counsel's office. So it's stretching the bounds of interpretation to achieve the public health mission, but being respectful and mindful of the courts and industry when they've said you've crossed the boundary and we're going to push back on it. So that was fascinating. But I will say that having the perspective of the regulator and how they think and understanding the process has been an invaluable part of my career in private practice. But I also think I've learned the most from companies, from consultants, from people like you, because when you're inside the agency, you have the ability to be very focused on the agency's perspective on things. But I think that I learned more FDA law in private practice and more about the practical challenges and applications of those legal theories, just helping companies solve their problems and being curious about, well, how does this really work in practice? And what do these operations mean? Because you can give somebody a very legally sound and accurate answer, but it's actually the wrong answer if you're not considering the business and operational impacts.
Right.
And that was to me the biggest learning curve coming out of FDA and into private practice.
I wonder how could we get, and obviously it's probably too big a problem for us to solve, but how could we get that level of experience back into the FDA so that when they're taking the enforcement actions, obviously you may not have the answers now, or it'd be interesting if you had any thoughts on it.
Some people have a very negative view of the revolving door of people sort of going in and out of the agency. But I think that it's beneficial because you're constantly updating and recycling the perspectives and the knowledge of people who've had the benefit of working in companies or in industry or for companies going back in, coming out. And so I do think there's a learning and an evolution of thought that happens from that. Some people have a negative view, but I actually think it's beneficial both for the agency and industry. I think I've seen an evolution from when I was there, so many years ago in terms of the agency's willingness to engage with external stakeholders and really learn about and understand sort of the practical applications of law and regulations. I will never forget one of my first cases. It was a big consent decree. It was an injunction action against a very large global pharmaceutical company. And I had been at FDA, couldn't have been more than a year. I had gotten a reputation while I was in the office. I would always get handed like the weird cases or like the law that nobody had looked at in 30 years that we were now going to try to enforce and apply. And I thought it was sort of like hazing, but this one was pretty standard GMP quality, major systemic issues. And I remember sitting in a room across from the general counsel of this huge company and a big lawyer from a big outside law firm with Rick, my boss. And he was like, your meeting. No clue what I was doing. But I was in my full FDA mode. And I said something to the effect of, we are going to shut down all of your operations because you're not making lawn sprinklers. You're making, medical devices. And I thought I was being very, FDA enforcement. And the general counsel looked mildly horrified, but then chuckled slightly. And he's like, yes, we understand we're not making lawn sprinklers. And we understand that we have, significant issues here. But what you're saying would effectively shut down our business, would make critically needed medical devices unavailable. There are serious operational considerations to what you're suggesting. So we need to, find a middle ground. And it was like an aha moment for me in terms of not knowing what you don't know and really needing to listen.
Interesting. No, that's good. I never thought about that revolving door part, but I can see that was encouraged. You're bringing that in.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting thing that you said is that you got into your FDA mode. Do you feel that might have come back from the communications that background there, or is that just something like I know when I'm going to a tough situation, I have to get it in the mode?
Well, you're the regulator, right? You're in an enforcement context. And as a junior lawyer, I felt like I had all the power in the room, which wasn't true, in fact. But the mode was truly believing that there were problems here, that the company had an obligation to address the problems in a way that ensured the safety and effectiveness of the products. And that was core to what we were doing there and why we woke up in the morning. So I really took that in. But when I say in my FDA mode, maybe my regulator mode, because I was still a very junior lawyer who still had a lot to learn about how companies function and the economics and all these serious considerations, the jobs that would be implicated by what we were asking. And so it was a teachable moment where even though I was sort of in my enforcement role, it was a teachable moment for me with the general counsel sort of, kind of laughing at me almost.
Right,
What
right.
do you think you're saying here? Um, but, laying out the implications of what we were asking so that our enforcement approach and what we were asking was calibrated to achieve the goal without creating all of these additional unintended consequences. So it was a good lesson.
Do you think that meeting would have gone differently if the chief general counsel wasn't admitting that, hey, there are serious quality issues?
For sure.
Yeah.
For
Okay.
sure.
Okay. One of the things in working in supplier quality, we're almost like the forgotten part, unless the three is almost directly on us.
Mhm.
But a lot of the items do affect what we do. And sometimes when I've seen certain responses back to the FDA, I'm saying to myself, this is not manageable. You're going to be back here 3 to 4 years. Is that where you would come into play? Like getting that type of feedback and saying, hey, no, guys, we need to push back on here because if you do this, this is a temporary band-aid. They're going to okay it now, but now you're going to have to maintain this and it could put you in long-term trouble. It's worth the fight now.
Yeah, for sure. So I think in both of our roles, right? You're helping the company to solve problems. You're trying to translate law into practical, actionable business advice, but also helping the stakeholders internally to calibrate risk. And so my perspective is never overpromise,
Right.
right? And so as a lawyer, I defer in a lot of ways to the professionals like yourself and the people within the company that actually have to implement these legal regulatory requirements. And so my approach is always to pressure test, to ask the questions that I think the agency is going to ask. And having had the perspective of being in the agency and the regulator is helpful. But like you, having the perspective of advising lots of different companies at different stages of different sizes who've been in similar situations, you can also benchmark and
Yes.
help companies to benchmark. This is not really possible. Like you are promising something that is going to require you to hire 200 more people. So maybe before we write this down and commit to doing it, do we need to have a conversation with the head of the business? Do we need to have a conversation with finance or the CFO? And so being a lawyer is as much about understanding the law, being able to interpret and advise on the legal requirements as understanding the business and being able to connect all the dots, because a lot of times people tend to work in silos, exist in their silos. Legal is a cost center, quality is a cost center, the drivers of revenue within companies. And for a lot of those folks, especially in quality and supply chain and supplier controls, they view themselves as the tip of the spear, right? Because when things go wrong and the regulator comes in, it can shut down a business.
Yes.
It can shut down a manufacturing facility. So they take those, they tend to be very conservative, and they tend to be very focused. So sometimes I view my role as bringing in that outside perspective, and helping people to move out of the silos and think big picture. across the organization.
Okay. Okay. No, very good. Very good. So you've been at the FDA 6 years. Now you're going on back into private practice now. It's okay.
So it wasn't a plan,
Okay.
right? It wasn't planned. I wish I could
Such
say that I had like a roadmap and very structured. It wasn't like that at all. I had handled, because I always got the weird cases, um, case at FDA that had made news at the time. And it was FDA, the first time that FDA had attempted to use its civil money penalty authority to enforce the medical device reporting requirements. So it was an authority that the agency had had. It existed for a long time. There was a company that the agency felt was not complying with adverse event reporting for medical devices. And so they were like, oh, we have this authority. We've never used it for this. Let's see if we can use it.
okay.
And the case made sort of the trade press. And because of that, there was a very well established, well known DC based law firm with a regulatory practice. And they had invited me to speak at the Food and Drug Law Institute, which is the organization that was founded through a memorandum of understanding between FDA and industry to sort of be a neutral convener for education and information around FDA regulatory and legal issues. So that was my first kind of introduction to Fidley. I'm now the chair of the board of Fidley. So these through lines have been there, I guess, and lots of full circle moments for me at this stage. So that was my first time I was invited to speak on a panel, and I was very nervous about, talking about the case and FDA enforcement. And then after that panel, the partner at the law firm, who's, a very respected practitioner, and really showed me the ropes in terms of how to translate being a government lawyer into private practice at the level that was a little bit more senior than being a junior associate in law firm. He called me after that panel. He said, have you ever thought about going to private practice? And I said, no, I've been there. I've done that. I've got really young kids. I love my job. And he said, well, let's just talk. Let's just, get to know each other, kind of like we're doing now. And, that conversation turned into a broader conversation. And long story short, I ended up leaving FDA to go to that law firm. I went in as a counsel, made partner a few years later. And so that's how I ended up back in private practice. And I would say the other kind of consistent theme for me professionally was and is taking a risk, right? I was not at all sure. I didn't know, how I would manage being a working mom with young kids and the demands of private practice. But I just took a risk. I didn't have all the answers, but I kind of bet on myself, and it was a great decision. It was tough in some ways, but a good decision. And I think the biggest thing that was challenging was pivoting from the regulator mindset to being a counselor and an advocate to the companies that I once regulated. And that was, I think, pretty challenging initially, but I had some good advice.
Did it feel like you were like crossing the fence there to go and work for the other side?
A little bit.
Yeah.
I got a little bit of razzing when I left the agency, but I think the difficult thing initially was a client would present an issue, and my knee-jerk response was, oh, that's violation. Can't do that. That's being in the end of the conversation. And there's really great partner, Arthur Levine, who had been at FDA in the chief counsel's office in the very early stages of that office and had long since transitioned into private practice. He wrote the enforcement manual. So he was like, I was kind of learning from this great group of people who'd also taken this journey from being in the agency to private practice. He pulled me aside. He said, okay, as a lawyer in private practice, we don't tell our clients that they're violating the law and the conversation ends there. We have to understand their business. We have to counsel, we have to give options, we have to understand what their pressure points are. And I was like, oh, how do I do that? And he's like, you just have to get curious about how companies work. You have to talk to people, you have to ask questions. So that was, I think, the biggest mindset shift for me. And it took me like a good 6 months to figure it out.
Okay. Okay. Interestingly enough, as you're telling your story, I'm consistently hearing mentors, leaders that invested in you, that saw a path for you and potential in you. What is it that you were doing? Why they looked at you as opposed to maybe the other people who were in the area?
I don't know. That's a good question. I do think there's a difference between mentors and sponsors.
Okay.
And I've had both really great ones. Mentors, I tend to think of as people who are helpful guides and are helping you either because that's their role or there's a disinterested generosity. They help you to understand the mechanics of the operation, how to do things, how to solve problems, and that's invaluable. I've always benefited from having sponsors as well. And I think that in those are organic relationships, whereas mentors can be formal. Most organizations have a structure. Sponsors, I think, are different because they see something in you that is either adding value to them, right? Or that reminds them of themselves. But a lot of times you're exhibiting character traits that they view as a value add to getting the work done or to some goal that they have. So it's not always the person that you would think it is. Or, I mean, most of my sponsors were people that I wouldn't naturally gravitate to. But I think it was that I was demonstrating curiosity and honesty about the things that I didn't know, and I just find people interesting. So I was always asking for the history and the story. And I think that they just saw those traits and that I was a hard worker, still am. And they were like, yeah, this is somebody that can be useful on my team. So therefore it is in my interest to invest in this person, help them figure it out and tell her what the written rules and what the unwritten rules are, because it's all a value add. And those are people that sometimes pick you, you don't pick them. Right.
Right, right. And I think sometimes when you're going through that time and you're at that stage of life, it's difficult to believe that you have something of value.
For sure.
You
For
know,
sure.
and what you were saying about hard work, being honest, being curious, the curiosity is going to make you ask, reach out, network, all of those different things. You know what's interesting? I find that people in the later stages of their career, there's almost a sense of legacy,
Mm.
and say, okay, I see this person. Yes, I could always get somebody else to help me, but I'm going to get a little extra from you. They're going to take what I'm going to tell them and go and do something with it,
Yeah.
you know? And even as I think about maybe other people who will see this, yeah, I think about those people earlier in their careers say, look, be curious, be honest, work hard, do a great job, and be open.
Yeah.
Be open. Yeah.
I think there's also an accountability piece too, right? We all make mistakes. Sometimes they're big mistakes, right? But I tend to think that the people that I gravitate to are people who are willing to take the feedback, who are willing to admit when they've made a mistake, who are offering solutions about how to fix it or address the problem. And they're committed to the constant improvement, right? Because none of us is completely finished, right? And in my world, they call it the practice of law for a reason. It is practice, and you're learning and evolving at every stage of your career. You're never at a point where you have all the answers, right? So it's people to me that demonstrate those characteristics that I tend to gravitate to. But generally, I feel like I've been really blessed and really lucky to have lots of people along the way who have helped me. And it doesn't take a lot to pick up the phone or to respond to a LinkedIn request. And I have a general rule. I have to be mindful of how much of that time and energy, especially at this stage, I give and to whom and how much. But generally, I will have a 30-minute conversation with just about anybody, right? Who's curious, who wants to talk, who's seeking advice. How much I invest and the way that I invest, after that is somewhat determined by how they show up and whether I think I can add value.
Right.
But I think we all have a responsibility to do that because none of us got here entirely on our own.
Right.
Right. So I think that's very important.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. It's very, very important, I think, for anybody watching this, just to understand like what you're saying about accountability. I remember this story. I remember when I was just started working. We have morning meetings, getting ready to ship product out. I go down there after a while, maybe 6 months or so in, I'm signing off to send product. And I go into a morning meeting and I'm looking at the board and I say, wait, it said it's waiting to be shipped. I'm like, I think I shipped that one. I was like, I had that dread that's coming to where
Yes.
immediately the
Yes.
slide comes down in your bag. And you're like, I'm like, wait a second, did I ship the wrong? I
Oh.
go down to the floor, and I see the wrong one in the box, and I'm like, what am I gonna do? It's like, will anybody realize? And I was like, you know what? I might get fired over this, but I need to go and tell them.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget. I went and told my management, and especially one of the people who was sort of like that sponsor. She said, okay, well, have you tried this? It's like, yes, I tried these different things. I checked here. This is what I would do next. Similar to that
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah.
And she said, okay, all right, we'll figure this out. We'll talk about it in the morning meeting. It was not as big a deal as I thought. But even later on, when I ended up leaving that company, she spoke to me about that later on. And I said, okay, that was a moment. I didn't realize that was a moment, but that was a moment.
Yeah.
That actually, believe it or not, that they thought they could trust me, to say something,
So important. So important. Yeah.
It's interesting.
That's a great story. It's a great insight, right? Because so much of what we do is about relationships and it's about trust, right? You could be the smartest, consultant, scientifically sound, impeccable credentials. But if people don't trust you and if they don't believe that you're credible, and sometimes the credibility is saying, I actually don't know the answer to this, but let's be thought partners together and let's figure this out. Or I don't know the answer, but I'm going to find the answer. And here's how I'm going to approach that. I think that credibility, the honesty, the integrity is so integral to what we do and to having your advice land well, especially when you have to give bad news or when you have to push back or you have to admit, I approached it this way and that may not have been exactly the best approach, but here's the upside and here's the fix. I think that people ultimately respect that. And I think that that foundation of trust actually builds better outcomes, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So you're in private practice and that brings you to this point, I'm guessing.
Yeah. So I was in my first big law firm right out of FDA. I stayed there for about 7 years, learned the ins and outs of how to practice and how to build client relationships, and was very grateful for that foundation. And then, I was probably in my early 40s or just turning 40. And I think that's a time for a lot of people where you just start to think about what's next and where do you see yourself in 10 years. And it was just about the time that I was starting to get really interested in what FDA might be doing. Back then, we called it health IT. Now we call it digital health. But I was really starting to just write about what if FDA regulated software and apps, and it was based on some work that I had done while I was at the agency where it was really on the cusp of FDA, articulating a framework for how to regulate standalone software in digital health. And I was starting to just write about it because I was interested in it, and then started to get clients and companies calling to say, we saw that you were writing about this and we'd like to talk to you, and was building my practice in that direction. And at that time, another law firm reached out and said, hey, we do a lot in the healthcare field, and we think there's a great synergy between the FDA and the healthcare and the health IT be willing to explore. And it was just another point where there was a lot of risk. They didn't have an FDA practice. They didn't understand what this practice was. It was coming from a law firm that had sort of built this area of regulatory law. But I was like, yeah, now I'm going to take a risk and figure out how to build an FDA team. And so I stayed at that law firm for 8 years, a little over 8 years. And then one of my very good friends and partners at that firm came the DLA, was here for a little bit and called and said, I think you should, check out DLA. They want to have a chat with you. And here I am.
Awesome. Wow, wow. So is building an FDA practice, does that feel sort of like entrepreneurship like? Because I imagine if it wasn't there before, you're doing a lot of the things that would be very entrepreneurial in that sense.
Yeah, I think for most of us, right, in consulting, as in, private practice as a lawyer, you are your business, right? Even if you're working in a large organization, you are selling your expertise, you're selling your knowledge, your brand, and you're also selling a team and capabilities, right? And so I didn't have the first clue how to do that, but I knew from the different work experiences that I had what a great team looked like and what that felt like to me, and the kinds of people that I wanted to be around. And I think the pivot point for me was I am a planner, so I always have like a professional development template that I've developed. And the first part of it is kind of like my personal mission statement, like who I am. Some of it is aspirational, who I want to be. The second part are, what are the things that validate this mission statement? Is it recognitions? Is it what you're doing in the community? And then the third piece is like 3 to 5 goals, concrete goals that you'd like to achieve within the next 3 years, 5 years. And I have that document. And when I was considering leaving my first firm to go to the second firm, and also when I was considering leaving that firm to come to DLA, I took that plan out and I sort of pressure tested the personal mission statement and all the things and the goals. And usually for me, there's something in the goals, right? Where you look around and you say, I want to do this thing. Am I going to be able to do this thing where I am? Or do I need to move? And for me, when I've made the move, it's because there's a thing. It's usually tied to the team or the platform where I say, I'm not going to be able to do this here, or I could do this better or differently somewhere else. And that usually helps me to answer the question about whether it's the right choice. And so the entrepreneurial part of it is really trying to, again, be curious about your clients, understanding who your target client is. Right. Why do you want to work with these kinds of companies and people as opposed to others? And really being honest about what is the value you bring. Where are there gaps, right, that you might need to fill? And also recognizing that you might not be the one to fill the gap, is that you need this skill set or this personality type or this expertise to build out a cohesive group or offering that really adds value. And that strategy piece that lights me up. I love that. And so that's the challenge to me.
Okay. Okay. Interestingly enough, you have this plan that you've used, and which I imagine you've updated, and it's been sort of a guiding path. But what's the motivation behind it? I imagine you're making sort of a cost benefit analysis. You're analyzing, okay, what the risk of me staying here in this position means. There's a good chance I might not hit this goal. What's the downside to staying and not hitting the goal?
Sometimes there isn't one, right? I think The benefit of having a plan for me is twofold. Sometimes you can get into an echo chamber, right? Where you're surrounded by people who think like you and who tell you all the things that you want to believe are true about yourself or your situation, or whether you're using your talents, or whether where you are is the highest and best use of your talents and what you have to offer the world. And sometimes people are incentivized to tell you those things because they like the status quo. It works for everybody, right? So the idea of having that plan is you're constantly pressure testing, right? And I love it when clients do that. Are these things still true about me? And if they're not, why not? And is this something that really still matters to me? And if so, how do I achieve that thing in where I am? And sometimes I think just going through that calibration in a structured way for me helps me to make better decisions, more informed decisions, and have a degree of comfort in taking the risks or the decisions that I'm making. So that's the purpose of the plan. And sometimes things that I thought were goals, I can cross off of the list, right? When you really sit down and say, you pressure test, are these things still true?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Have you ever been scared making these?
All the time. All the time. I tell people, like, there's some weeks where I'm scared every day. But I think the purpose of having a structure, a plan, something that you go back to is helpful for me in dealing with the uncertainty and the questions. There are things about myself that I know to be true, regardless of what circumstance I find myself in. So being able to kind of go back to those things in a structured way and have honest assessment. Like, I'm not as good at this thing here. So I'm going to need this kind of support or this kind of person. And then it allows you to have really clear conversations about what you need to be successful in this new position or in this role. And either those things are there or they're not. And so if they're not, there is no fear. The choices are kind of made for you. Either you're going to be able to create those things for yourself or you're not.
Right.
Right.
Right. Right.
So
Okay.
that's the purpose of the plan. And I share it with people. And some people say this is insane. Your brain works this way. Some people say the way my brain works too.
Right.
But the biggest part is, I think, when you're sort of in a churn, right, about your career or how you should be spending your time, what goals are really achievable. I like going back to this framework of pressure testing your personal mission statement. Is it still true? Are these things still true? What's the validation, right? We work in quality for these facts that I'm stating about myself, or is that still true? And being able to really look at yourself honestly has been helpful. The other thing that's been helpful is having what I call a personal board of directors, right?
Okay. Okay.
You and I work with boards, we
Yeah.
advise boards on, regulatory issues, but I think having a personal board of directors, in much the same way that a company has a board, you have different people with different skill sets that serve different roles in your life. Some of the folks on my personal board of directors are people that I've known my entire life. Some of them are people that are those sightlines who are at the next phase or the next level, or, have achieved something that I want to achieve. Some of them are peers. Some of them are people that I lead or who are junior to me. But the commonality is they're people that I trust. They are people who are truth tellers. And so once I map out the plan, I always consult the board. And I think it's just important for everybody to have that. And most of us do, I think, who achieved any success. We just might not call them that or think of them in that way, but
Okay.
it's very important.
How did you assemble this board, so to speak? I mean, I imagine it's obviously you're not sitting around a conference table, but I guess it just came about organically, informally.
Yeah. I think it's just the people that you carry with you. And some of them are clients, right? Where I will finish a project and I will call and I'll say, how do we do? What could we have done better? And there's a baseline of trust where they tell me the truth. This was great. This was not so great. And that's all a part of the learning. So when I'm trying to make a professional decision or decide, do I need this kind of team member, or how do I learn this area, whether it's AI. I have people on my board of directors that I can go to because they have perspective, they already know the issue, or they just know me. But I think the central theme is they're truth tellers. There's a baseline of trust, and these are relationships that have formed organically over the years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
We must have 2 days worth of stuff here.
Yeah, pretty much. There we go. We'll move into the, we've talked about it quite a bit throughout. I wanted to get your perspective on like the new QMSR. Are you good with that, or you want to that way? And
I'd ask you your perspective on it.
yeah, so hit that button, switch it up. Oh, great. You're still good. All right. Let's see. Where should we go? Do you do M&A stuff, or remediation is?
I do a little bit of everything.
You doing that?
So we can talk about QMSR if you want. I have some high level thoughts.
Okay.
I might ask you some questions.
All right. So switching gears here a little bit. Obviously, we're in February. We're maybe almost 2 weeks from the new release of the QSMR. Are you hearing from clients they're worried? Are you getting calls about it? There's nobody really reached out?
Not yet. First of all, I think it is a good and necessary step that FDA has done this. For the past probably 20 years, the agency has been focused on globalization, right, as an impact on quality and safety. Because the reality is, you and I both know, is that there are very few medical devices that are manufactured solely and completely in one place. Often a lot of the larger global strategics have grown over the years through the acquisition of many different companies and products and regional systems of doing things where, some companies might be focused and using an ISO model. Other sites might be solely focused on, the old 820 and the FDA quality management system. So I think the move towards integrating ISO and the 820 to respond to the global realities of different regulators and that a lot of the global regulators follow ISO and the companies, I think it's a good step in the right direction. And I think much like when the EU MDR implementation went into effect, a lot of companies are looking at this. They have good global surveillance processes in place. And so my sense is that this is not causing a lot of stress or anxiety. I think companies have been preparing for it and aligning their internal systems. Maybe part of the unknown is what the actual impact will be when FDA moves from the QSIT inspection technique to the new inspection technique under the new regs and what that will look like in practice. So I don't get the sense that companies feel unprepared, but I think there will be a lot of learning and maybe a lot of the questions will come through the inspection process as a lot of learnings happen with FDA. They don't issue a guidance on everything. A lot of the things that we learn and figure out, happen from the inspection process, from, the enforcement actions. And so I anticipate that as we get further down the road and further into the year, that the questions will come, and a lot of those questions will come from how FDA adjusts the inspection process and the focus. What are your thoughts? What are you seeing?
Well, what's interesting? Like I said before, I work almost not exclusively, but a lot of my time in supplier quality. And in general, unless there was a complaint that led back to a supply component, we weren't really under the gun, so to speak. And a lot of that was because they couldn't look at like supplier audit reports, and then which they then didn't look too deeply into the supplier side.
Yeah.
But with that changing with the QSMR, and with risk being added,
Mhm.
from an ISO perspective, I think companies really need to take a look at their supplier quality because more and more companies are essentially just end assemblers.
Yeah,
They
for sure.
see the product in
For sure.
and then with all the acquisitions, as you mentioned, they're now bringing an entire supplier base who was managed different
Y-
than what they're going to
Yeah.
manage them as. And that
Yeah.
integration process takes time. So I think there's going to be more pathways to get into supplier quality, whether it could even go through management review, all these different sides. And then one of the things that always seems to come up again, normally through the complaints part, is when you start looking into like the validation part
Mhm.
with the suppliers. How are you validating their components? Unfortunately, a lot of times it's a little bit more sloppy, so to speak, like in comparison to what they do internally.
Yeah.
Internally, the statistics,
Tracking the trend, everything is pristine.
go into the supplier quality side, and it's not as great,
Yeah.
as sophisticated, which to a certain extent, you don't worry as much about patient safety in those cases because there's so many downstream
Mhm.
controls.
Yeah.
But now is another point that you can get, hit by the FDA on. And it's really a lot of a business risk as well.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to catch it in your internal manufacturing. You catch it at the component level.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how that develops.
Do you think, and I know you're
Well,
asking these questions, do you think that the shift, right, means that companies will need to start integrating procurement or other functions that may be outside of the pure QARA ecosystem in thinking about supplier controls in a different way? And if so, how? I mean, that's one thing that I keep going back to. One of the most challenging things I think for companies is siloing, right? Everybody knows their job and then there's a handoff. And sometimes you miss the connection points and the big picture to other parts of the organization that are doing a piece of the process. And that might be procurement, where you're just managing your vendors and managing your vendor contracts and making sure that they meet all of the general compliance frameworks to be a supplier or vendor. Do you feel like there's a shift in how companies need to think about those two functions and maybe bringing them together in a different way?
Absolutely. And sort of my prediction, we'll see if it's true,
Okay.
is with the increased scrutiny, it's only going to take a few warning letters in the supplier quality due to being able to look at supplier audit reports and delving deeper to purchasing controls for companies to be even more um, stringent on how they inspect and what they do when product comes in,
Mm-hmm.
which can be a good and a bad thing. You can drastically slow up your business process by doing things like 100% inspection, all these different things when there's so many other sampling techniques that will get you literally 99.999% reliability, not including what happens downstream. And if you're not working with procurement correctly on those, you could end up with products sitting in the receiving dock
Mm.
for a long time, suppliers not getting paid on time because they're not issuing payment until it's inspected, or they get paid and then now they have to issue a credit because you inspected the lot that we shipped you 6 months ago now, and now you're asking for credit. So
Yeah. Wow.
if they don't work together and really plan out how things look and then see how they can optimize supplier quality area, I can see a lot of problems happening. And of course, once you get those inefficiencies, that's when the corners are getting cut because you're over resourced,
Right.
over tasked, and then compliance issues, and then calling you.
One of the interesting aspects, and maybe this will be an outgrowth of the QMSR, is how companies are increasingly using AI for some of these, what we would call traditional kind of GXP functions. Right. And so one thing that I'm watching, I haven't had any calls on this yet, but is two aspects of this. The extent to which, because of the focus on supply chain and supplier controls, the need to be more buttoned up and have more greater visibility, particularly with global supply chain issues. Whether companies will start to deploy AI solutions to track vendors, to assess, to do incoming product acceptance activities. So that's one issue, and how FDA will look at that as a part of the supplier qualification process. The second part that has become an issue for me for a lot of companies is that companies are insourcing third-party AI or foundation models, not only as sort of the brains or key components of AI-enabled medical devices, but increasingly they are insourcing these foundation models and AI platforms to perform supplier qualification, pharmacovigilance types of activities. And so one of the things that I am fascinated by, and sort of watching the trend lines on, is how FDA will approach that integration of AI third-party models from a supplier standpoint, i.e., what controls do you have around where you're getting your AI from when it's used for GXP or for other functions. And then I think the second thing is how you validate those models or other solutions that you're using for supplier controls or other GXP types of activities to perform from a quality management standpoint. So I find that element of it really exciting.
Yeah.
And I think it's a place that we should all be watching.
No, 100% agree. And it's one of those things that, in a way, I say we don't apply proper logic to it, or I would say a fair scale.
Mm.
It's like self-driving Tesla cars. If one accident from a self-driving Tesla car is considered, in terms of harm, probably similar to 10,000 accidents from people driving cars. It's what we know. People drive cars, they will get into accidents, things will happen. Now we're putting this trust in a self-driving car, even if statistically, by every metric, it is better than people driving. It only takes
It's the one, right?
so it'll be interesting to see how we survive, because it will make a mistake.
Yeah.
How do we approach that, rationalize that as we move forward with this? And the validation question, that in and of itself, that is such a interesting thing to think about. 'Cause, things are changing. It's could be learning. How do you track the learning process thing?
Yeah,
You know.
for sure. It's incredibly interesting, but this is what I love about the space that we're in, because you are trying to use these very old regulatory frameworks and concepts like QARA, like validation, to apply to technology that none of us could have imagined 5 years ago in some cases. And that's where the learning takes place. And that's what's exciting about being what's exciting about being in this space. And what's interesting about, I find that FDA, particularly on the device side in the last decade, has been much more willing to engage with industry, not just to, issue regulations and take positions, but really to learn, because the technology is advancing so rapidly that in order for them to keep up with the pace of regulation and enact regulatory policies that make sense, they almost have to be in learning and engagement mode, because the innovation is happening, outside of the agency,
Right.
and to solve these problems. So it's a fascinating time to be doing what we're doing.
It is. It is. Okay. To wrap up, if you were talking to the you coming out of college, from your perspective, let's say coming out of law school, what advice would you give yourself, or encouragement, or anything of that nature? What would you say to yourself?
That's a tough one. I would say get over the imposter syndrome, because we've all had it at times, right?
Absolutely.
I remember coming out of the agency and having this perception that because I had been at FDA, people expected me to have all the answers and feeling this incredible sense of like, I don't have all the answers. So I would say the biggest advice is just to commit to continuous improvement, commit to getting incrementally better every day, and don't practice scared.
I like it. Vernessa, thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you. This has been wonderful. I appreciate the opportunity to exchange all of these ideas with you.
Awesome. Thank you.
You.
It's